Welcome to episode 2 of Think Through. Today I'm talking to Professor Howard Robinson, a research fellow at Oxford University. Robinson is a major player in the philosophy of perception, mind and metaphysics, and is both an idealist and a theist inspired by the work of Bishop George Berkeley. His books and publications are too numerous to mention, but today's discussion centred around his recent book, Perception and Idealism, linked below. In this episode we discussed theories of perception, why matter should be rejected in favour of idealism, and why this eventually leads to a Berkeleyan kind of theistic idealism where God is the source of our experience and the divine lawmaker. I hope you enjoy. So early on in your book, Howard, you talk about perception. So we'll start off by talking about perception. But in it, you discuss what you take to be the main puzzle of perception. Can you just tell us what that is?
Yes, it's that experientially, in perception, we appear to reach out and, as it were, touch the world, particularly in vision. You think that visual consciousness, so to speak, reaches out to this red wall that you can see behind me when I turn around. And yet we know this as a matter of fact. What's happening is a process coming from the world to my senses. So it's somehow or other, a reaching out consciousness is sustained by, so to speak, a process that's reaching in, an impacting process from outside. And how do you put those two things together? And that's why I suppose I think it's in Plato or perhaps somebody earlier than that, the suggestion is that things radiated out from the eye and they came in from the object and sort of met in the middle, shook hands, so to speak, in order to bring those two things together. Well, that's obviously a silly theory, but it does express how both parts seem to be there in some sense.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes, I can see that. So there's the subjective way in which we encounter the world is as if our consciousness reaches out, and yet the scientific account talks about the world impacting on our senses from outside. That sounds, yeah. Okay, great. So if that's the main puzzle, can you give us an idea of the landscape of potential ways of solving that puzzle that people have put forward philosophically?
Well, the naive realist theory, or direct realist of a certain sort, is that indeed we are aware of the world out there in some sense directly. And all the causal process does is stimulate the experience, but the experience relates directly to the world out there. It somehow chooses what we select to experience, rather than anything more than that. It tends to play down the importance of the causal role in a sense, or be embarrassed by it. That's, I think, naive realism.
So why naive? Why is that naive?
Naive, not in the sense of silly, but in the sense of that's the way you probably start off before anybody gets you to think about where there might be problems. We take ourselves to be seeing the world directly, so it's naive in that sense. So initial theory that how things strike us before we might have worried about whether there were some difficulties or not.
Right. Okay. Yeah, and how? Well, maybe I shouldn't have interrupted you. I should let you finish off. So we've got naive realism is one way of solving the puzzle, and what are the other?
The other is representative realism. So that the causal process produces, as it were, a photograph in our minds, but it's a photograph that's pretty well a good representation of what's out there. So it's no great mistake to take it for what's out there, but it is actually an impression in our minds, and that's what we're actually aware of. And some people would want to say, well, strictly speaking, you've then got to argue from that to show that there's something out there. There's an inference, something of that sort. And then the other theory was a more straightforward sense datum theory. I should have said there's two forms of representative realism. There's a traditional one, where there's the inner photograph, so to speak, and inner sense datum. And the other one in which what's inside is just some sort of representation of the properties out there. It's not an instance of the properties. I mean, a photograph, if you photograph a red thing, you get red in the photograph. On the sense datum theory, if you look at a red wall, you get red in this mental image or whatever you want to call it. On the representative theory, you just get a mental state that is of-red, an intentional state, as some people put it, reaches out like a belief reaches out to something beyond itself. And then there's the straight sense datum theory, where you may or may not be a representative realist, as I said, or you may think that the outside world is nothing much at all like what it looks like according to the sense data. Or you may want to be a phenomenalist. You might want to say, well, the physical world just is all these experiences we have put together in a nice way.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let me just try to sort that out from what it sounds like you said. So the naive realist that you began with plays down the out to in direction of causation, as you mentioned, and sort of majors on the in to outward direction that we sort of directly encounter the world in our consciousness. Whereas the representationalists seem to sort of major on the out to in, because we have the causal process impacting on our consciousness that creates this photograph, perhaps, or at least some sort of form that through intentionality, which presumably is an inward outward sort of direction again, fills in the content.
Right.
Yeah. And maybe that, I don't know if that's a fair gloss or not. And then you talked about phenomenalism, which is where there isn't really this distinction between the world as experienced and the world out there. But how does that phenomenalism differ from a kind of idealism or a kind of direct realism? Could you explain that?
Well, it's part of a certain sort of phenomenalism. I mean, a Berkeleyan idealism is what John Foster called a theistic phenomenalism. So the physical world is a structure out of all the experiences available to us. And then the question is there are two books by Michael Peltzar recently, who is a phenomenalist, but not a theistic phenomenalist. He thinks that's all you need for the world, that there are these experiences available. He thinks that is very close to it. It is J.S. Mill's kind of phenomenalism. What's striking about that is that they don't think there needs to be a causal explanation of why these experiences occur in the first place. The ordinary representative realist or materialist thinks, well, there must be some explanation of why we have these experiences. It must be the physical world. That's the most natural. That's what we believe automatically, if you like. And the Berkeleyan idealist says, well, there is an explanation, and it's just that this is the world God creates for us, the world of experience. He doesn't have to create matter as a way of making these experiences. He just provides the experiences. And they, following it really on a tradition of Hume and Mill, and now Michael Peltzar says, no, you've got to stop your explanation somewhere. And the basic facts are these experiences occur. And that's all there is to it.
Right. Okay. So so we've got the naive realism, we've got the representationalism, and then we've got some phenomenalism or idealism. And I realize that there are further categories within those three. But could you give us a bit of an idea about where currently sort of academic philosophy is on this? What's the sort of split here? Which is the most currently popular approach to this stuff?
Well, it's not like things used to be.
Okay.
I mean, after the Second World War, any kind of sense datum theory became very unpopular thanks to the work of J.L. Austin, a bit later probably of Wittgenstein, and other people. And so you couldn't believe in sense data at all. You had to be some kind of direct or naive realist. And you had to be saying, well, there's no real problem about perception. It's all invented by philosophers, more or less. Mike Martins, who's a very, very, very good philosopher, still wants to defend that view. But in the last few years, the idea that there's a serious problem about perception and naive or direct realism or whatever you want to call it doesn't win ground automatically. I mean, Austin and people wrote Austin's book Sense and Sensibilia was all about trying to show that all the arguments for the against naive realism were bad arguments. They've come under much more attack. I mean, the Austin views in the last 30 years, 40 years, I don't know. That's a debate in which I played a part.
Okay, so if that naive, the sort of optimism about naive realism being where it's at has now come under pressure, what does that cause people to move towards? Does it get them to think again about some sort of more representationalism, or does it move them towards phenomenalism? Or mainly
towards some kind of modern representationalism, where what there is, if you like, in the mind is the sensory consciousness of red, not something red. Now, some versions of that, the ones taken by people who are very materialistic on the whole, who don't like sensory qualities in the mind in any form, is to regard that as just a form of belief, or something very like a form of belief. David Armstrong in the early 60s started this off with a belief theory of perception, and then with a dispositional theory of what a belief is. So what you actually acquire is a disposition to behave as if there's a red thing in front of you, which is then identified with a brain state. Many, though, intentionalists, like my colleague Tim Crane, and probably most intentionalists, don't want to reduce it just to belief. They say, on analogy with the belief, just as you can have a belief in fairies, or a belief in the King of England, or a belief in fairies don't exist, the King of England does, a belief in the Yeti, who may or may not exist. Simply, you can have an experience of or as of red, and it genuinely has a red glow about it in some sense or other. It's experiential. It's not just an ordinary belief like a cognitive belief, like an ordinary thought. But nevertheless, there may or may not be anything there that answers to it. So it's an attempt to have the best of both worlds, in a sense, in my opinion. So just as if you think about the King of England, it really is the King of England you're thinking about. You're not thinking about your thought of the King of England. Whereas the fear with the sense datum theory is what you're aware of is just something in you. And to make it intentional is mean that somehow or other the sensation of red does put you in touch in some sense with the red out there, though it's not just a belief. It's something more sensory. That's what they're trying to get at, the intentional theories. And I spent 3 chapters in the book that we're talking about trying to show how that doesn't work. But that's another matter.
Excellent. Yes. So we'll get on to, I'm going to ask that very soon. So just again to summarize for people. And this is maybe a bit of a spoiler, but I don't think it comes as a shock. So obviously you're in the idealist camp, but you also have a sense datum theory of perception. So
right.
We'll get on to that, how that works out in a bit. But could you first explain, sort of in terms that people could understand, what you think is the root problem with the naive realist position and then the representationalist position that you distinguish yourself from?
Yeah. There are 2 traditional lines of argument against naive or direct realism. One is what gets called the argument from illusion. And that is that objects often, and perhaps always, don't ever look quite the way that they actually are. First of all, they look different as you move around them. Their shape, size, and all the rest of it changes. But something that's happened, I've been aware of recently, in my left eye, there's a kind of scratch on the retina, and a straight line goes a little blob in it. Now, even if you say I'm aware of the external world, there's something about me modifying that. So there's a subjective component, contribution into how it looks. How do you put together the contribution made by what the object is actually like with this subjective element to produce a unified experience? Now, one way of saying is, oh, well, the experience is just what's caused by the whole process, including that bit of the process that has a kink in it, so to speak. But then that makes the whole experience seem like a product in me. And that's not a form of direct or naive realism. So that's a version of this, of the argument from illusion. The other argument is quite, in a way, quite much related to it. Other people don't dismiss the argument from illusion completely. Mike Martin, who I was giving classes with last term, his classes, always refers to it, knowing perfectly well that I want to defend it, as the most absurd theory which nobody believes anymore. The other emphasizes the importance of the causal role and says, look here, if somebody stimulated in your brain the very brain state, visual states that you've now got, and there was nothing outside you, you'd still have the experience of seeming to see all these things that now you seem to see as being outside you. But if that's a subjective phenomenon, a kind of hallucination, and if that's what the ordinary process produces in the end, well, you're always aware of something like that anyway. So what you're aware of is a product of the brain, as it were, or perhaps a part of the brain, if you're going to try and be materialist about it, not something out there. That's how the causal process works. And so you get talk about brains in vats being given experiences just like they might have had if they were really walking around the world and that kind of stuff. So that Mike Martin thinks that is the powerful argument that you've really got to fight against.
Okay, let's see if I can summarize that back to you in a way. So the idea is that the direct realist or the naive realist thinks that the world that we experience is the world out there in a direct way, but they have some sort of admitted causal account. They recognize that those objects cause those experiences. And the difficulty with hallucinations then is that whereabouts in that causal process they come in, because obviously they are not taken to be of external objects. And that hallucination can be made particularly salient if we think about the most proximal cause of our experiences, which would be in our brain. And the direct realist is typically committed to that causal process from object through to brain stimulation to then conscious experience, but wants to say that the content of that experience is directly of the world. And so then the question is that if it were possible to create that brain state in a way that doesn't involve an external object, maybe directly, it would seem to give us the same conscious experience as we would get if there were an object doing the cause. And then the question would be, well, if there's no difference from the phenomenal point of view between a causal process that originated in an external object and a causal process that was direct through a stimulation of the brain, what role left is there to talk about it being of an object, or there being an object directly encountered? Am I missing something in that?
Don't express it as a form of skepticism. There may be causal reasons for thinking there's an object out there that is quite like it, but that what you're aware of, not merely the awareness, the being aware, but what you're aware of, in some sense, is what is caused in you. Yeah. And the reply that some people try to make is what gets called disjunctivism, the disjunctive theory, that hallucinations are just different sorts of things from perceptions, in the sense that the very thing that you produce in hallucination is not produced in the perceptual case. And, well, the argument gets complicated at that point. But why, if it doesn't normally, if hallucination isn't the process doing what it normally does under abnormal circumstances, then why should it happen at all? And Mike Martin argues, well, there isn't actually any contents to this experience. You just can't tell it from a real experience, but there aren't really any phenomenal properties there in any way. And other people say, what on earth is that supposed to mean? I say, what on earth is that supposed to mean?
Yeah. So it seems to me when I was reading your book that at this point that the way I understood the argument where it hit me is very plausible, even convincing, is that if the disjunctivist then gives some account of what we experience in a hallucination that relates only to brain states and some other kinds of cause, why is that explanation not also sufficient to explain our everyday perceptions of the world. If you can explain the perception just by talking about a brain state, in cases of hallucination, why is that not the full sort of necessary and sufficient explanation for our veridical perceptions, our true perceptions in normal circumstances? It almost then seems as though this additional explanation of this object of experience outside it in the causal process is unneeded.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
Yeah, that's what I would feel too. Yes.
Okay, so I'm not claiming that argument. I read that in your book. That was sorry.
That's probably why it's right.
Yeah, it's probably why it's right. Probably why you agree. That's right. But that was the bit that sort of jumped out and spoke to me. Okay, great. So that's naive realism dealt with. How about the representationalism?
Well, there's two sorts. There's the traditional kind, and there's the modern intentional theory representational kind. The traditional kind, I try to deal with in the argument for idealism. In other words, it's the nature of the matter that's supposed to be out there that's problematic. In the intentional theory, well, I spent 3 chapters on that in the book, but the simplest way of looking at it is this way. Supposing you have a partial hallucination. So you're looking at a white wall that's got some writing in the middle of it, and somebody gives you an hallucination about playing around with your brain of a big blue patch just big enough to cover out that bit of the white wall that's got the writing on it. Now, a sense datum theorist would say, okay, you're aware of a patch of blue, which is obfuscating what you would normally be aware of, the bit of the wall out there. The intentional theorist, the representationalist, would say, oh, no, you're having a representation of blue, which represents blue being in just the same area as the bit of the white wall with the writing on it. What's the difference? What's the difference between those two? Given that these representations are not like beliefs, they are phenomenal representations. They're representations with experiential content. And so there really is no difference. Now, that's an argument that some of the naive realists, like John Campbell, and I think Bill Brewer, use against intentionalism. And so do I. Roughly speaking, it is a disguised version of the sense datum theory. Mm-hmm. Once you're not like Armstrong or Tye, who think they're just beliefs or just information, once they admit that they don't merely represent, but present, they're presentational, as John Searle puts it. In other words, they have this phenomenal subjectivity to them, then you might as well be a sense datum theorist. You're just invented a new jargon to avoid saying that it's really red or really blue or whatever these representations. And it's not fair.
Right. So you're a sense datum theorist of a sort, coupled with idealism. And so you see then the intentionalists as sort of trying to have it both ways. And if they were going to be sort of rigorous and honest about things, they would sort of come over to your side. So can you tell us a bit about your side and how your sort of particular theory and how it differs from the one you've just described?
Well, in a sense, when I was asked to write the entry on idealism for the Oxford Companion to Philosophy of Mind or something, I said, well, idealism is not really a theory in the philosophy of mind, but it's a theory about the nature of the material world. So there's a sense in which my theory of the perception is not very different from any other sense datum theorist or a phenomenalist's one, or from Hume or from Berkeley. They call them ideas, but their notion of ideas is in effect quality patches, and Hume's impressions as well. And so the argument then transfers to, okay, do we need an explanation of why we're having these experiences or not? And if we do, what is it that's doing it? And the natural common sense view is, there's the physical world out there that's responsible for these experiences. And that's when you move on to the other argument, the argument about, well, okay, what's this physical world then? That leads to either theistic phenomenalism or just phenomenalism, depending on how you answer various questions.
Right.
Yeah.
And so how then, from that sense datum theory, do you approach the main puzzle of perception, the reconciliation of the inward and outward directions of perception?
That's going to rest on two things. What is the physical world? And what's its relation to the experiences we're having? Now, a phenomenalist, including an idealistic one, says, okay, the physical world is just what you get when you think of these experiences as presented in an ordered way, in such an ordered way that you can apply physical object concepts, tree, table, body, to them. So there isn't a question of those things causing your experience. They are what you experience. Now, okay, but then you do have an account of, yes, now this is getting more and more serious. You still want an account of these objects that we postulate, which are constructions from the experiences that are available. But the causal processes are just further experiences you have if you're a scientist examining what goes on to the light and all the rest of it. So there isn't really an issue. There is an issue about why you think the experiences happen at all. And if you're a certain kind of phenomenalist, you just say, okay, well, that's what the world is. These experiences happen in a nice ordered way, and explanation's got to stop somewhere, and it stops there. That would be what J.S. Mill would say. And it's what Michael Peltzar says, really, more or less.
Okay.
Berkeleyan says, no, we want an explanation. This brings in one of the most important disagreements, and it's not just on this issue. The disagreement about a priori probabilities. Hume's great skepticism, part of it was, what on earth do we need an explanation for? And Hume thought you only need an explanation for an event which you know by experience is not the kind of thing that normally happens. And so if what normally happens is when you look that direction, you see something red, there's no need to have an explanation of why you see something red when you do that, because you know that's what normally happens. Somebody else would say, no. I mean, that we should have all these experiences just like that, and that they happen to fit with each other, as far as we can tell from the noises other people make when they're speaking. We want an explanation of that. And the Humean will say, no, there are no... You're saying it's objectively improbable that these things should just happen. Well, that's an a priori account of what's probable and what isn't. And you can't get this a priori purchasing about it. A.J. Ayer was very fond of developing that argument. Barry Lower, when defending a Humean theory of causation in his latest book, which is a bit like Lewis's, but not entirely, I said, Humean theory of causation, these things just follow each other. You don't need a law of nature, or you just call those regularities laws. You don't need a power, you don't need forces or anything like that. These things are just how the world works. It doesn't just... It's not that every day just happens, the sun happens to rise, and it just happens to rise. There's more to it than that. And so that's one of the big issues, whether you can justify your need, which common sense seems to require. You can use a priori probabilities. You don't want things to stop until you've got what looks like a complete explanation. It's not quite Leibniz's sufficient reason principle, but I suppose it's got a touch of it.
Right, yes. So that's starting then to stray into questions about explanation of the kinds of perceptions we have. But before we jump into some of the more metaphysical sides of things, your theory of perception is that what we experience when we experience the world is sense data. And that the main, when you take that approach to the main puzzle of perception, then there is no, you haven't introduced a causal account at that stage of what causes the sense data. You're saying that's now the debate that you have later on. So you don't have the difficulty with questions over the causal process that a naive realist does, because they still have this outward in direction of the world causing our experience of it. And then as far as the inward out direction goes, well, there is no kind of outwardness, because right now you've just got the sense data is your theory of perception.
Yeah, but
is that?
Yes, except that, how to put this? First of all, I want to say, if you're an old-fashioned representative realist and believe in the material world, that also solves the in-out. It's just that it gives you this inward experience which you take to be, which seems to you to be out there. And so my objection to that is the problem with the nature of what's out there, and not that there's anything wrong with saying that as such in solution to the main problem. Yes, now I've now lost my grip on the main bit of your question.
Yeah, so what we'll do then, I think, is that so the main puzzle isn't yet solved at this point, it seems to me. So far, if at this point we've now just accepted that there are issues with the naive realist view, so due to the hallucinations. So instead you have a sense datum view, and that coupled with what we'll talk about later in terms of your metaphysics will explain the inward out direction. And as yet we haven't got an account of, and that will also then talk about the outward in, I presume, as well. How is it that whatever is out there causes the sense data? But can you, before we go into that, can you explain then why this account doesn't have the same sort of problems with hallucinations that the naive realist is confronted with? Because you can have, presumably you still would say there's a difference between your seeming to see a blue patch on the wall and actually seeing a blue patch on the wall. There may be some, you presumably want to differentiate between a hallucination and veridical perception, do you?
Yes. If I hallucinate a pink elephant sitting in front of my fireplace, my wife comes downstairs, she won't see it. So it's the availability generally that distinguishes the one from the other. And so it's the publicity of the available experience that makes for objectivity. Similarly, when I used to have glasses and when I took them off and everything got blurred, my experiences were just as real then as they are, when the glasses were on and the things weren't blurred. But the inaccuracy consisted in the fact that that's not the way that somebody who had good vision would see them. So it's not in one sense a difference in the status of the experiential contents. It's a difference of their relation to what you might call the standard experience. That's what normality consists in.
So veridical perception isn't actually then going to presumably be absolute across species and so forth, because it will be relative to your species. A veridical perception for a bat or a dog may well be very different to a veridical perception for humans. So what we take to be veridical perception is presumably of some sort of idealized member of the species, and then a hallucination would be one that an idealist member of the species would not have. Is that right? Right,
yeah. I don't think you need to be too idealized, because the notion of exactly what the object is like can be left a bit fuzzy in this theory. So normal good vision it would be a way of putting it. But you're now making a point that I make. I say the directness of the experience consists in the object two components. The informational component of experience. One agrees with what gets called the belief theory in this far. Even if you're a dog, as it were, the experience seems to tell you that the bone's out there, that your master is coming, this kind of thing. The informational content relates to something external. And the experiential content seems to be of something. So your master seems to be about 6 foot away, and you believe the master's just coming through the door, and it looks as if he's just coming through the door. So the phenomenal side of it is accurate, or pretty accurate, and the properties presented are those properties that objects like that present to a creature like you. So in that sense, it's veridical and accurate. You don't expect it to look to you the way it would look to a bat or a snail or even a dog. You expect it to look to you the way it looked to a human being. So in so much as it's doing that, and in so much as it seems to be informationally where it is, roughly speaking, then it's directly informative. It's a kind of what I call sense datum direct realism. The trouble with traditional things in sense datum theory, often people thought in the empiricist tradition that thoughts were just images as well. So if you've just got images, then you're locked in your own mind. But if you have a theory of thought where thoughts can be genuinely about things, and if you think of information as being rather thought-like, even in the case of a dog, it's taken to be relating to something out there, then you've got as much reaching out within the context of the sense datum theory as you need. That's what I claim in the last chapter on the bit on perception. And that's my way of saying there ain't no problem here, really. It's very interesting that the medievals, perhaps not Aristotle himself, had a version you might call the sense datum theory, a percept theory. But they weren't skeptics. They didn't think they were going to be solipsists. They weren't worried about it because they took it that this somehow was an accurate conveyor of the information about what's going on there.
Yeah. Okay, great. So here's what surprised me when I read your book as a novel way of looking at things that kind of flipped things around for me a little bit. And I just want to check that I didn't misread you and that I'm getting you right then. Is that I would have thought, at least naively coming to these ideas, you take the phenomenal experience that you have to be outside of mind, or the world as presented phenomenal experience you take to be outside of mind, and you take thought to be inside mind. And so it's sort of what gets you beyond yourself is your senses, and what is internal is your thought. But it seems almost as though you're flipping this around the other way in perception. That in perception we have the phenomenal experience is within mind. It's the presentation, it's the sense datum that we experience, which has a certain privacy to it. It's sort of your personal sense datum that you encounter. But it's through the thought that comes with it that structures that into properties and objects and beliefs that automatically form that, such as you said, the dog presumably hears something, that's a sense datum, and coincident with that, it forms the belief my master's coming through the door or my master's nearby. And it's the thought that actually is what reaches into the world, or is that objective or public content.
The thought in the informational bit informs the datum. In other words, it's responsible for why the datum appears to be out there. So it's not that you have this photograph and you say, oh, that looks like my Uncle Charlie. You don't have to make the inference. The intentional bit is what enables the object to look, to appear to be 6 foot in front of you. So it's an experiential thing, not an inference. I mean, it's a bit as if you'd never had any visual experience before, say, and you suddenly were given the visual experience you're having now, the sense of whether this was just a sensation in you or a thing out there probably wouldn't, the difference couldn't hit you. So it's the web of belief that enables, just as it enables you to see a thing as a car or a table, because you know how to conceptualize and recognize these things. In that sense, the intentional theory is not entirely wrong. The thinking bit is doing a lot of work here, but it doesn't mean that the red patch that you have subjectively is not a red patch. It doesn't mean it's only of red, as if the red thing was just what's actually out there. And then you have the problem, well, science says it's the objects that are not red, so what's red at all? Oh, well, nothing's really red. All that kind of stuff that some people say.
Okay, I think there's a lot that's quite appealing, and it does seem as though if we're looking at other kinds of ideas that, especially if we link aesthetic and aesthetic judgments with that less cognitive aspect of our experience, we often think of those as being much more subjective in nature than what we would describe the world as being, which would be sort of more in the cognitive thought side. That's quite interesting. So there's one thing on this which I think is related that I'd like to pick up, is you talk a bit about how your understanding of this perceptual structure should be understood in Aristotelian terms and not Kantian terms. Can you sort of explain a little bit what you mean by that?
Yes. What I mean by Aristotelian is that, according to Aristotle, the world out there is already organized into kinds and properties of the sort that we become aware of. So there are, in the experiential realm, there's the red things, there are square things. We don't impose the basic categories on the world by the way we think. Whereas for Kant, our understanding is entirely a matter of the structure of our consciousnesses. And we can say nothing about what the world out there is really like, which is why Hegel said, let's do away with it then, or what people did. The noumenal world is kind of pointless. Now, in an empiricist tradition, you can end up with saying, well, we don't know much about what's out there in the physical sense, just the structural features of it that you get by the mathematics. I don't think, perhaps Kant was not in a position to have that sophisticated view of what physical science could do. I'm not sure. But you do at least capture the structure of the world according to the Aristotelian picture. And for Aristotle, you think you captured more of it because he's more of a naivist about what the world's actually like. Lots of qualities in it and things. So I'm rejecting the Kantian notion that we impose our way of thinking on the world such that we can know nothing about what the world might be like in itself.
So really the question then is about where is the source of that structure that sort of coincides with our phenomenal experience coming from?
Yes.
If you're Kantian, it's something to do with the human mind and the way it works, and you're suggesting it's something to do with the nature of things, the nature of reality.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So, okay, I've got a couple of questions on this then. So one is that, on the one hand then, you're suggesting that the phenomenal aspect of experience, or the sense data, are species relative. Well, they're kind of what counts as veridical sense data would be relative to the norms of our species. Whereas you're suggesting that the structure is in reality itself. So do you think then that dogs and bats and so forth would have the same coincident structure with their phenomenal, even though their phenomenal experiences are different?
I think a dog will react to the same way to a sort of square object or a hole that it's trying to get through as we would. Now, so there's an informational sense. Let's forget about bats. That's maybe just so incredibly different. I'm not sure. But in an informational sense, that kind of content, which let's call it structural. So we, the way the dog behaves, we could use our science to explain that. And the dog couldn't do the science, but what we're talking about is it's reacting to it in the same way, something like that. So
okay, so I've got two more questions on this, because I didn't expect the conversation to go this way, but this is really interesting. So I'll ask. Don't let me forget the other one. Okay, so if we take, say, Wittgenstein's claim that, if a lion could speak, we couldn't understand them, that to me seems to be based on the idea that the kind of conceptual apparatus that a lion would use to categorize its experience, which, the structure of our experiences often seem to be the basis of language, that there would be too much of a disconnect between the kind of categories and the conceptual structure the human applies to experience than a lion. So it would mean that we couldn't communicate with them. So it sounds to me, if I were to adopt your sort of theory of perception, I would disagree with that and think that there is enough overlap between the structural experience of a dog or a lion or others that allowed for that intercommunication. I know I'm springing this on you, but I just wondered what you might think.
It could think such that it also could speak. Take the Martian case. One might think it'd be quite difficult to get through to a Martian in the end, but their physics wouldn't be that different from ours. So something like that. And so in the case of the lion, I don't see why. Well, that was a juicy meal.
Right. Okay.
So, yeah, I don't particularly. There may be other reasons why lions are not going to speak, but I don't believe. Yes, Wittgenstein is very much locked in language. I mean, consciousness is linked only to language. And I was watching a sort of podcast thing of Dennett not long ago, and he said that what's given in experience is just what we say, and that's the cause of the malign influences of Ryle and Quine together, as it so to speak.
Okay, can I try and put this into practice then to just check that this is all working? So imagine, okay, here's a water bottle. So presumably when I perceive the bottle, I perceive it as a bottle because that's the way in which that experience is structured automatically. But I am certainly able to sort of pay attention to it, not as a bottle, but as water plus some outer casing plus a lid plus a label. Or I can sort of re-look at it, or I could even think of there's a top half of a bottle and a bottom half of a bottle. And these sorts of far less maybe natural sort of concepts that I might deploy to structure the environment. How do you see the difference between these sort of ways of how the world presents itself to us that can kind of seem almost pre-packaged in a certain way according to the universals that might be out there or the objects that are out there, and then the way in which we can kind of seem to impose our own alternative structure on things?
Well, that's not an alternative structure in the sense that you're just dividing the thing up a bit more. It's not a relativistic alternative structure where you're saying, oh, no, the object really consists of this bit of this here and that bit of there, and that's more like an object than the other thing. So if the lion could speak, and it could speak enough, then it could talk about the top half and the bottom half of the bottle, I suppose.
Okay, so I mean, I guess what I'm wondering about is that, and I know this is getting off topic, so you may well have not had a chance to think about it, but so Lewis, for example, his ideas of mereology are that, well, any object is just the way in which you decide to sort of arrange things. You can have these gerrymandered objects, and I can sort of reach into the abyss and pull out some random collection of things and think of that as an object. And similarly with GRU properties and so forth. Presumably that way of understanding how we might structure properties or objects would be in tension with the kind of pre-given structure that I understand to be part of your theory of perception.
Well, certainly in the case of GRU, I mean, Goodman's nominalism, I think it's a reductio of itself. I think Goodman was a dealer in modern art, and I think he thought that modern art was no less or more representational, except in a conventional sense, than conventional art. At least if he didn't, he ought to have done all that. Now, if Lewis wants to say it's a purely contingent matter, that we cannot follow through space-time naturally a combination of objects that don't naturally move together and of which following them would have no purpose whatsoever. There could be a creature that did that just as naturally as we do it with a solid object that's of some use to us. But I don't think he wants to say that. He wants to admit that these objects are useless, but you can just as much call it an object as anything else. Now, what does that actually boil down to? So the reason why this interest in middle-sized dry goods from hylomorphists came in is one way of running between, the Im Wagen, forgetting about people, the in Wagenish position that there are no complex objects really, that are only the bits, the atoms, and the view that anything counts as a complex object. It's just as real, not just as possible to do it by convention, but just as real as anything else. And they seem to be two ways of almost saying the same thing somehow or other, independently of the causal properties of the collective. Namely, the arbitrary ones don't have any real causal properties, a unified kind, and the others do.
So I've read material beings, and so often the argument is presented as the only two sort of respectable positions are either mereological universalism or mereological nihilism. So there are no middle-sized dry goods, or everything is an object. And it sounds to me as though you're saying there's a certain primitiveness in reality about what are real objects, at least in terms of perception. Is that right?
Yes. First of all, if you're just being an atomist about the physical world, assuming the physical world for a minute, phenomena don't enter into that world in any very as being part of the bits, the extra bits, so to speak. Now, I suppose some people want me to write something on middle-sized dry goods for a spin-off from a conference that happened in Oxford a few months ago. I don't think I will. Obviously, from our perspective, epistemologically, you've got to start with middle-sized objects. Any scientific theory about what really is there in the physical world in the normal sense, it's going to be speculative and going to turn out to be wrong anytime. I'm not going to be wrong. There's a table here. So it's epistemologically absolutely essential that we have those concepts. The question is whether these objects are, in a purely ontological sense, the primitive objects. Now, a certain kind of Aristotelian thinks that natural objects are primitive because they have something called a substantial form, which is what organizes the matter and makes it do what it does. And that's what the 17th century science didn't like, because they wanted bottom-up explanations, probably rightly when it comes to purely physical things. So some of my Aristotelian and Thomist friends don't like that. They still want there to be the bottom, top down, particularly in quantum theory. But do you know Bill Simpson? William Simpson?
No.
No, he was in Cambridge till recently. Now he's in Austin for a moment and was at Oxford last year. He and Rob Coons, who's the professor in Austin, Texas, all think that some kind of hylomorphism unifies the mysteries of quantum theory, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But that's a big difference from saying that there's a substantial form of an oak tree. Quantum theory leaves you to say almost anything. Well, it's very difficult.
Yeah, sure. Okay, all right. So I think that's probably most of the questions on the perception I wanted to ask you, and it's been very helpful to understand that. Maybe two more. So how you talked about judgment, or I can't remember whether you changed the word that you used. Can you sort of explain how judgment interacts with perception? Well,
judgment, information, this is what we might call propositional content, without being committed to the view that the thing that has it has what we call propositions in the head, depending on how far propositions are related to language. That's why I also was saying information. I'm pretty sure that the dog, as it were, knows what it's doing and knows what's out there. It's very, very keen. The dog we sometimes look after, its owners, particularly its mistress, tries to embrace her every time she arrives, if she's been away for any time. And Spog, the dog, knows absolutely who this is, and it in some relevant sense of knows that it's something outside itself, and all that kind. So in that sense, information perception is informative, and we take it to be. Certainly, we do. It's very difficult to divide that from what you might call the most primitive kind of thought. I think recognition, for example, is very difficult to distinguish from sensational experience, which is one reason why I think it's very difficult to separate the cognitive from the barely sensory. But that's another matter.
Right.
I'll write about that now.
Yes, that would be interesting to pursue, but we'll leave it aside. I think maybe then lastly, before we get into the metaphysics side of the idealism, do you have a theory of truth that relates this informational content?
I think I'm a fairly straightforward correspondence theorist for most purposes. I've never been particularly taken by what people who want to say anything else are trying to say. But it's not something I've worked on in great depth, because I've never seen. I mean, the coherence theory the coherence theory is presumably destroyed by possible world theory, even if you don't think there are possible worlds literally, because all possible worlds are coherent, and they're not all the actual world. So, and then the other things, the tasky ones, well, that's all formalism. And, so in so much as I've bothered with that much. I must have written an essay about it when I was doing philosophical logic with David Wiggins in 1966, Trinity term.
Yeah, okay, well, we won't jump into it too much. I mean, there are questions then about, say, mathematical truths or other kinds of truths, and how that might relate to the reality out there. Certainly for observational truths, the correspondence theory would fit, I suppose, quite well with your theory of perception if there are universals and so forth. But yeah, okay, we'll move on from that. So you, in the second half of your book, or the second part of your book, in that's less than half of the book, you deploy, to begin with, an argument against physicalism. Can you just tell me a bit about? I know a lot of people are quite excited to hear you as a warrior against physicalism. Sort of. First, we'll just say a little bit what physicalism states and why you think there's a problem with it.
Second, the second half of the book is an argument against the existence of matter. I mean, other books I've written against physicalist theories of consciousness, so you could be perfectly a good dualist and be disagreeing with everything in the second part of the book, like Descartes, who was not an idealist. There's this physical world out there. And the physical world is something that's made of matter or material. What is matter? Well, let's start off with Newtonian little hard billiard balls, or Democritean. Now, that was criticized by the Jesuit Boscovich in the mid-18th century, because if you have really solid objects, it takes an infinite force to make one bounce off the other. So they've got to be spongy. And Boscovich put forward this theory according to which matter is really more or less like a magnetic field with no hard bit in the middle. And that's how the bits react. And that got Boscovich made the first foreign member of the Royal Society in the 18th century, I think. And he was very distinguished in this stuff. Now, if you think that the physical world is forces, fields, energies, you basically got that picture of it. And you might say that is the modern picture. And if you think there's a hard bit in the middle, what's the relationship to the hard bit to the forcey bit? Nobody's ever managed to do that. So you end up with the picture of physical nature as basically forces following mathematical laws, something like that. Well, the trouble with that is a power or a force is just the ability to affect something else. And if what it affects is just another force or power, you end up in a regress. So this is just the ability to affect that's ability to affect something else, ability to affect something else. And even Simon Blackburn, who's not anyways an idealist, says in that little article in the analysis in the early 90s, well, the only thing that can end this regress is something like a sensible quality. But let's not worry too much about that. I mean, Simon's wonderfully dismissive in quite a ridiculous way. And both Michael Dummett and Bob Adams, like Michael Dummett, took the qualitative nature of things. The only paradigm we've got of that is something experiential. And so that made them both think that when it comes to the crunch, this regress of influences, so to speak, has to terminate in something which is actually a conscious experience. So that's the only thing that gives cash value, so to speak, to the physical world. So that's roughly the argument. The notion of the physical is only these powers influencing one another. And you can only catch that in terms of something that's experiential. And so really it's all there just as it influences mind. And that's a kind of phenomenalist position. And I do in that chapter look through in a lot of detail the ways of people trying to reply to this and relating the qualitative stuff out. I mean, Lewis, for example, has quiddities out there, which are goodness knows what. They're a bit like qualities, but we've no idea what they are. And they're the things that actually, well, they don't actually own the powers. Lewis's position is a bit more difficult because he doesn't really believe in powers. He doesn't believe in real forces. So you've got to have something to relate the Humean laws, the constant conjunctions, as it were. So he needs it in that way, not just as an owner of the powers, because there aren't really powers. If you like, for Lewis, when you've got a magnet and iron filings, there's a hard magnet and there are hard iron filings, but there's no field really. The field just is what the filings do when they're near the magnet, so to speak. Yeah, so that's the reason that the collapse. Even if you look at Locke, what is matter? It's impenetrability. Well, that's only a disposition. The idea was that solidity, it's a real felt quality, but it's a felt quality. Impenetrability is meant not to be experiential necessarily, but is only what something will do, or rather won't do. And so you can't escape the notion that the external physical world is fundamentally a dispositional powers-ish forces thing, and only the experiential gives you any qualitative hang on it. So that's the argument, though I do go into lots of alternative positions, including quantum theory, which I hope you're not going to ask me about.
No, I'll spare you that. But okay, so just to sum up then the regress, if we had the idea that there were no hard bits, which I know you consider that option as well, to do with the vibrating ball in all these dimensions as well, I remember in your book. So anybody who wants to look at that, what you say about that idea. So if there are no hard bits and everything is dispositions or forces or capacities, there needs to be at some point a way of knowing what that is, because otherwise the content of that gets indefinitely deferred. And the content of it must be something that we experience, that we can say, point to. So how does that, if you introduce qualities, something experiential, how does that cash out the chain of powers? How does that stop the regress?
Right. Now, you're asking a very difficult question there, which is a bit naughty of you.
Sorry.
No. So what's the relationship between the scientific structure and the experiential structure? this world in question. Now, I think that the Berkeleyan, the theist, has got this answer. The experience.
I hope you're enjoying our discussion so far. Our conversation continued for another 45 minutes, and this can be seen on the extended version of this episode. Extended versions, along with a host of other exclusive video content, is only available to YouTube members, but you can join from as little as $3 per month, and it really helps support the work I do so I can do more of it. If you want to become a member, then you can click the link in the description or the join button, and I'd be most grateful. Thank you.